My deepest appreciation goes to Den He Chao Pao and Lifelong Learning Institute for organizing this talk. Today I'm going to share with everyone a topic that is very close to my heart, looking at Islam in Southeast Asia, mainly looking at two countries. Being a Singaporean myself, I mean, what happens in Indonesia and Malaysia certainly has implications on Singapore. So this will be the title of my talk, Negotiating Identity in Nusantara, an Indonesian and Malaysian Perspective. But this will be an overview of my lecture for tonight. First, I'm going to be give a general overview about Muslims in Indonesia and Malaysia, and I'll touch a little bit about Singapore as well. And then the second part will be looking at issues concerning identity. When we talk about identity of Muslims today, we have to go back to history and look at several episodes that determines what a Muslim is in this region. So I'll be looking at three topics, namely how Islam came to Southeast Asia and what kind of Islam came here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a very important episode that shapes Muslims today in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, some things that happened in the 1970s. And this is basically what I'm trying to say today. What happens, or how you see Muslims in this region, in Singapore, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia, you have to go back to 1970s. I'll explain to you why later. It's got to do with politics and the leadership of that time. And then lastly, I'll be covering contemporary issues and concerns about Indonesian Muslims, Malaysian Muslims, and Singaporean Muslims. These are some of my works that I've published. And if you look at some of my works, it deals a lot with Malay-Muslim issues, politics, and Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia. So some of these issues, I know is only a 1 hour, 1.5 hours talk. If you want to read more about these issues, I've written quite a bit about this. You may want to refer to them. But some of the issues today, I've written them in such publications. I also have looked at some smaller publications, Muslims in Johor, Muslims in neighboring Batam. So basically, I look a lot about Indonesia and Malaysia and its impact on Singapore Islam. And I've written also quite a bit, even shorter pieces, for those of you who don't like to read books and papers. These are shorter papers, 2,500 words. These are easily downloadable from the website. Just look at IC's perspectives, and you can download these articles for free. Some of the things that I've done also to look at opinion pieces. I also write for Straits Times and Berita Harian. Some of the articles and my thoughts are shared in these platforms. But I just want to also share with you how I conduct my research and how do I form opinions about Islam in this region. I do a lot of interviews. I speak to important players or important actors. So this is just a snapshot of some of the people who I've spoken to. Mainly they are the mufti. And who is a mufti? He's basically the top religious scholar of each country in Malaysia and also in Indonesia. Some of the pictures here you might be familiar. The man here, I met him when I was doing my PhD. Who is he now? He's the Vice President of Indonesia, right? Ma'ruf Amin. This man here is someone who has passed on, but a very influential religious scholar of Kelantan. So what I do is, apart from reading some of their writings and their interviews, I actually go down and see them and meet them, trying to understand how they look at issues concerning identity and also politics in their respective countries. I also do a lot of participant observation, meaning going down talking to people, and taking photos. So I behave like journalists also sometimes, right? Doing research. So basically I find meaning doing such work, and this is how I gather some of the data. I also look at writings, online primary materials, publications on the internet to look at the thinking. So today I'm going to share with you some of these findings based on my work that I've done in the 3 countries. But what are the issues perhaps non-Muslims see Muslims today? When we talk about Islam in Southeast Asia, 4 issues normally comes up. One is terrorism. Right? We all know about Jama'ah Islamiyah. We all know about ISIS, Islamic State. We all know about Al-Qaeda. So this is a huge concern when we talk about identity of Muslims in this part of the world. There are occasional terrorist attacks. So far we don't have, fortunately, in Singapore. In Malaysia and Indonesia, there were instances of terrorist attacks. So these are some of the concerns. Second issue, quite a very important issue, is this notion of Arabization that is happening. Are Malays becoming less Malays and becoming Arabs? This is always talked about in the newspapers, in discussions, and in debates. Is that true? The question is that true? Third is conservatism. That means the Malays and the Muslims are not progressive. These are issues of concerns, as I said. And lastly, political Islam. Less so in Singapore, because Islam here is not political, but in Malaysia, Indonesia, definitely Islam has been politicized. And as I showed you earlier, the man who became the vice president is an ulama or a religious leader, and he became the vice president just one below Jokowi. So it just shows that politics and Islam plays an important. Yeah. So I'm going to look at, let's briefly look at Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, and then we'll see the historical factors. Right, Indonesia is one of the closest neighbor. 261 million are Muslims. It is not only the largest Muslim country in Southeast Asia, it is the largest Muslim country in the world. So you tell me there are many more Indonesian Muslims than Arab Muslims, right? So should we be concerned about issues in Indonesia? Of course we have to be concerned about issues in Indonesia because it's the largest Muslim country in the world. Whatever happens in Indonesia will definitely affect the identity of Muslims here, surely. Right? So there are 34 provinces in Indonesia. There are many groups claiming to be representing Islam, politics, civil society, organizations, individuals. So there are many kinds of Islam or Muslims in Indonesia. They are so diverse. And it has a ministry that looks at religious affairs. But this is interesting in Indonesia. You know why? Even though it is the most populous country when it comes to Islam, it has a religious ministry that looks at all religions. So it has 6 formal religions, and Indonesia has basically 6 departments in that religion. It's not only Muslims. So technically, Indonesia is a very open society. Right? Even though it's a populous Muslim country, it respects other religions as well. Its ideology is not Islam. It is not an Islamic state, in Indonesia, because it is a Pancasila state. Now, what is Pancasila? These are 5 traits of Pancasila. Well, it does say that they believe in one and only God, but basically, we can say that it is a religiously neutral society. It is not an Islamic state. When we talk about Indonesian Islam, there are 2 organizations that mainly represent them. One is NU, and one is Muhammadiyah. I don't have time to go through these 2 organizations, but NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, is the largest organization with We don't really know the numbers, but it's the largest organization in Indonesia, and it's very, very politically influential. Its former chairman was the 4th president of Indonesia, Abdul Rahman Wahid or Gus Dur. Yeah? And you know the man, coming back to the man that I took a picture with, Ma'ruf Amin? He is also a member of MU. That means it's politically a very influential organization. The second largest organization is Muhammadiyah, formed in 1912. We actually have a Muhammadiyah association in Singapore. It just shows the historical links and historical ties. But it is the second largest organization in Indonesia, and both represent the moderate strand of Islam. But what is happening in Indonesia today? What is happening in Indonesia today? At one time, Indonesia was seen as the smiling face of Islam. What do I mean, the smiling face of Islam? Because to compare to other parts of the world, it's the most moderate, the most tolerant kind of Islam. It's a smiling face. But people are now saying it's no longer smiling. I don't know, it's frowning face of Islam maybe. Yeah? Because the society in Indonesia is polarized, is divided. The last general elections, look at the map here that my colleague has done. It's politically divided between Jokowi and Prabowo, and religion plays a part in dividing them. Right? So certain areas in Java, still Jokowi, but certain areas supporting Prabowo in Sumatra. So the country is somehow polarized by the politics that's going on in Indonesia. Yeah? And the Islamic organizations too were divided when it comes to politics. So the 2019 elections demonstrates the divisiveness of Indonesian society. All right, moving on. Malaysia is slightly different from Indonesia because it has a large number of Muslims, but it's basically a bipolar state. That means the number of Muslims is not that many compared to Indonesia. 61% of the country's population are Muslims. Even though it's not like Indonesia, what is different is that the constitution says that Islam is the official religion of the country. You see? So there's a difference. Indonesia is not, but in Malaysia, it is the case. And in Malaysia, there are 13 states, and each state is in charge of Islam. Now, who is in charge of Islam in the country? It is basically the Malay rulers or the sultans. I want to show you this diagram just to simplify what I mean about the administration of Islam in the country. There are 13 states in Malaysia and one federal territory. That's where Kuala Lumpur is, right? A federal territory, the center. And there are 9 royal families in Malaysia. So each of these states that has the yellow triangle represents the royal family. So 9 royal families are in charge of Muslims, the head of Islam in each of these territory. Okay? Now, what happens to some of the states that do not have sultans? Like Penang, Melaka, Sarawak, and Sabah. Basically, the Malaysian king is the head of Islam of each country. Right? So every 5 years, the Malay rulers, the Sultan will rotate to become the Malaysian king. So now the Malaysian king is from Pahang. Right? So he will become the king, and he will be the head of Islam for Penang, Melaka, Sarawak, and Sabah. Okay? So all these Malaysian religious elite or Malaysian religious council members will sit at the federal level to become the so-called religious gatekeepers of the country. Yeah? So that's how Malaysian Islam is administered generally. So we want to understand about Muslims. You go and cross to Johor, for instance, right? You can see who is the head of Islam is the Sultan of Johor. He is the head of Islam of that country. Yeah. But like in Indonesia, Malaysia is also quite politically divided. And this is a map, again, courtesy of my colleague at my institute, looking at how divided Malaysia is politically. Blue is Barisan Nasional. This is Najib Razak's party. So Malaysia, at this Peninsular Malaysia, is divided into three. These are the urban areas, right? This is the Straits of Malacca. This is the urban areas. This is where the Pakatan Harapan won. These are the rural areas. This is where Barisan Nasional won. Even you see, the state of Johor here is quite politically divided, urban and the rural. But you look at the green flags here. These are basically PAS, or Islamic Party of Malaysia. The state of Kelantan and Terengganu and parts of Kedah is still dominated by the Islamic Party. So Malaysia in the peninsula is divided into three parts. Now Sarawak is another issue altogether. But politically, when it comes to Malays and Islam itself, it's politically divided. This is another map showing the diversity. All right, Singapore, I will go through very quickly because we were looking at Malaysia and Indonesia. But Singapore, different is that it is a minority Muslim state, 14% of 5.6 million people. And there are also Malay Muslims, majority of them are Malays, the Muslims here, and there are also Indians and Chinese Muslims. But in Singapore, we have this act in Parliament called the Administration of Muslim Law Act. That means even though we are a secular country, we have an institution that recognizes the rights of Muslims. Muslims have a separate court, Sharia court. Muslims has a statutory board called the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. Yeah? But what we don't have here in Singapore is political Islam. We don't have a political party that represents Islam. Right? So Singapore, in a way, is quite different from its neighbors as well. So my point is this. Looking at the three countries, right? One is a majority Muslim state, but it's basically not an Islamic state. Malaysia is not quite a super majority Muslims, but it is an Islamic state. Singapore is a secular state, but has institutions that recognizes rights of Muslims. So you see, three different case studies, three different kinds of system historically. Yeah? Right, so we're going to focus on this tree. Let me start off by looking at the identity part now. When we ask any politician in this region, they will say that their country is a moderate Muslim country. Tun Abdullah Badawi, former Prime Minister, calls it Islam Hazari, that Islam practiced in Malaysia is civilization Islam. Najib Razak, former Prime Minister, until last year said that Islam Wasatiyah, or moderate Islam. Right? So all nation prime ministers would say that they are a moderate Muslim country. Crossed over to Indonesia, Jokowi used this term, Islam Nusantara, or Islam that is practiced at the archipelago. That means it is some Islam that recognizes the culture of Indonesians. So all of them say everything is fine in their respective countries. Is that true? As we shall see, as we go along in this whole lecture, we shall see some tension, some problems, and the term moderate Islam is basically problematic. All right, now let's look at the formation of identity. So I'm going to divide this into three parts. Right? First, in order to understand Muslims' identity or how they view things or their psychology, we need to know how Islam came to this part of the world. We're not talking about 100 years or 200 years. We are looking at, we are celebrating the bicentennial, right, this year. We are looking at basically 500, 600 years of history, right, in order to understand Islamic identity. So there are many theories about how Islam came to this region. Some people say Islam came to this region by force. Some people say that it's because of businesses. The Middle East came here to trade with us, and hence they converted to Islam. Some people say it's because of mysticism, because of dreams, and hence people converted to Islam. So there are many, many theories about how Islam came to this part of the world, and who brought Islam here. But one thing for sure is that Islam came to this region to a feudal society. That means Islam came to this region where there is a concept of kingdoms. And kingdoms itself is very harsh, very hierarchical, very authoritarian. Okay. Why do we need to go back to 700 years of history to understand Islam here? Remember the slide I showed you with all those many triangles? People wonder, how come in Malaysia the Sultan is the head of Islam? History. Islam came to Malacca, and basically the Sultan converted. So that is why, right, Sultan plays a very important role in Islamic affairs 700 years later on, right? And it is very top-down and hierarchical. Okay, so you need to understand history in order to understand why certain institutions remain here in this region. Second, some of you may have seen this mosque next to the ECP. Some people may wonder, why is this mosque located next to the CBD area? This is a very important shrine, a shrine of a very prominent mystical leader called Habib Noh. He's the descendant of the Prophet, and his family had ties with the Hadramis, or what today is called Yemen. Yemen is, of course, having civil war that's ongoing. But why is this man important in Singapore? Is because Islam that came to this part of the world are mainly brought by this kind of people. They're from Yemen. They are very mystical, some of them say. And they're also open to culture. They're very soft and moderate kinds of Islam. And this is an example of why the shrine such as this remains in this part of the world, here in Singapore. And what is the kind of Islam that is brought to this region is Islam that is quite soft. Remember I said earlier that Southeast Asia was seen as the smiling face of Islam. Why? Because Islam that came to this region tolerates the culture. It did not wipe out Malay culture. You can have your dance, you can have your lontong, you can have your mirabos, no problem. They can still be good Muslims because it did not wipe out the culture of the person, of the group. The dancers, they respect that. The music, they respect that. And that is the kind of Islam that was brought here by the Sufis earlier. For centuries, Malays have embraced Islam and they are quite tolerant. Some of the words, before Malays became Muslims, they were Hindus and they were Buddhists. Some of them were enemies. This one we don't. Right? There were traces of this in Indonesia. We see the Borobudur, for instance, right? So all these are showing that before Islam came, they were embracing other religions. But when Islam came here, it did not change the language. Did not eradicate some of the words, yeah? And some of the Sanskrit words are still being used by Malays until today. Some other words. So Arab words came in, Sanskrit words, Malay words, all mashed up. That expands the vocabulary of the Malays. The alphabets, some of the alphabets used are Arabic alphabets, called Jawi, are also borrowed from Arabic. Architecture, some of the mosques retains the Malay architecture. If you go to Indonesia, even Malacca, there is a mosque that looks like a temple because to them, they respect culture. Religion is religion, but the culture-wise, they respect. Yeah? Impact on arts, right? It shows the respect. If you go to the Middle East, the way Muslim women dress is basically black or white. But here in Singapore, in Malaysia, it's very colorful. Because it respects the culture of the person. But what happened? This is Ninja Turtle, this is not Malays. Are we experiencing a change? Right? Are we experiencing a change? Well, some people say yes, we are becoming Arabized. I feel that we are not, right? But there is a change that is ongoing in society. And here is where we need to look at the 1970s. I was born in the 1980s. And I grew up looking at this. When I was a young boy growing up, I was in the midst of change. So I can tell you all these stories. I was in the midst of change. I observed a change in society. I observed this group. This is a Malaysian group called the Darul Arkam. It was banned by Mahathir when he was Prime Minister in 1994. But the impact also came to Singapore. I see some of the followers here. They dress totally differently. This is not Malay at all, right? Now, what happened in the 1970s? Historical, you cannot escape talking about global situation. Fall of Ottoman, Arab-Israeli War, the Gulf War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Muslims in the world felt they were being colonized and they were weakened by Western powers. You must understand the Muslim psyche. They would feel that they were defeated after World War II. And then there were a lot of movements, Islamic movements in Egypt, that tries to build an Islamic state in their respective countries, had a great influence here. Our students studying in Egypt also get exposed to these ideas, but something happened in 1979. Earlier slide, I showed Muslims feeling they were defeated. They were being defeated by the Americans. 1979 came Iranian Revolution. 80-year-old ulama, who's a Shiite. Muslims here are Sunnis, they're not Shiites. But this is a Shiite state. An 80-year-old Ayatollah Khomeini toppled the king of Iran, who is a Western puppet. What does it tell you? It tells Muslims here that if we go back to Islam, you can topple the West. Then came the Saudis, because Iranians are Shiites, right? The Saudis feel that we need to spread Sunni in this part of the world to compete with the Shias, and then return to Islam and make sure that we are the one who leads the Muslims globally. And Saudis have petrol dollars. So they sponsor and funded a lot of groups here who are supportive of their projects. So these are examples of why Arabic influence came to this part of the world. You need to look at the history of what happened in 1970s. Yeah? There were also local factors that happened in Southeast Asia. First, there was a lot of economic development that happened in Malaysia and Indonesia. People became more educated, right? They have strong movements on campus. They become more Islamic and more religious, that they decided to struggle and fight for Islam. So most of these groups, right, fighting for Islam came from the middle class or came from the educated people. Let's compare 1960s. For those of you who follow P. Ramlee movies, I don't know how many of you here follow P. Ramlee movies. You can see the change in the way people dress, more depiction today, because people are saying we need to return to the Islamic roots. There is a greater concern for halal certification, because they feel that, they need to be greater Islam. And in P. Ramlee movies, he basically eats in a Chinese restaurant quite openly. This is depicted in the movie. But today is a different kind of society. It all started in the 70s. So basically, just to sum up that part, what happened in 1970s is to Islamize every aspect of life. Maybe we should repeat that. Right? We have Islamic university, Islamic economy, Islamic state, Islamic knowledge, Islamic institutions, Islamic everything, because remember the Ayatollah Khomeini, remember the Saudis, remember what happened locally. We can be better than the West. And to be better than the West, we need to embrace greater Islam. There's nothing wrong with becoming good Muslims. Please Get this right. There's nothing wrong with it. But what kind of Islam that is being championed? That is the main concern. Who were the leaders in the 70s and the 80s? Now, I want to touch on a very important political phenomena that explains the Muslim identity today. Suharto was the president of Indonesia, 1966 to 1998. The gentleman here, of course, we all know, came back again, but he was prime minister at the height of the Muslim resurgence after the 1970s, 1981 to 2003. There was a lot growing Islamic, right? So there's a growing Islamization that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This happened in Indonesia. Suharto and Mahathir were different. Suharto wanted to stop Islamization. One example is 1984, there was a riot called the Tanjung Priok massacre. There was a riot against Suharto because he wanted everybody to believe in Pancasila. They rioted. What Suharto did was basically ask the army to stop it. Tanjung Priok massacre. One example of Suharto early on wanting to stop by force Islamic resurgence. But he lost it. Because it was so strong, Suharto himself later said that no way I can beat the Muslim resurgence, I have to also become good Muslim. He performed the Hajj in 1990 and showed a greater Islamic face. He formed Islamic institutions. Later, this is later part of his, towards the end of his presidency. And look at this man next to him, Vijay Habibi, very top engineer, but a very, very prominent Muslim thinker. There's a lot of movies now made about Habibi. On Netflix, they are available too. You might want to take a look at, this guy is a genius, basically. He's a genius, he's an engineer, the person who built airplane industry in Indonesia, but a very strong Muslim leader. Suharto brought him back because of the influence that he has. Of course, Habibi later became his vice president and later became president. Mahathir is different from Suharto. Suharto tried to clamp Islamic forces and then embrace it later because he cannot stop it. Mahathir is different. Mahathir from the very beginning invited the resurgence into government. And you know this man, Anwar Ibrahim, he's an Islamic leader. He was that resurgence that we were talking about. Today is a different Anwar Ibrahim, of course, yeah? But that was Anwar Ibrahim. Very charismatic, influential Islamic leader, going against the government. Mahathir said, stop, join me. If he go to Indonesia, Suharto would have stopped him earlier, right? So it started with him joining UMNO, and then a lot of these Islamic projects came about. Islamic universities, Islamic institutions, and all these things happened. This is a young Anwar joining Mahathir. This was before he got sacked, in 1998. I really enjoy looking at these old photos. This is Najib, by the way. And this is Muhyiddin. This is Anwar. This man passed away, I think. Muhammad Rahmat. And same people are now running the country again. Ta-da! So this was again before he was sacked. Yeah? Very close. But Islamization was brought into the government machinery early on. What does this say about the impact of Islamization? Malaysia started earlier when it comes to all these developments of Islamization at a more contemporary time, because it was brought into the government by Mahathir. Right? It's Islamization from within. Well, you hear a lot of talk now that, the Islamic bureaucracy is so big in Malaysia. Why? Because it happened much earlier. Whereas in Indonesia, well, there are pockets of Islamization, but it's all over the place. Why? Suharto did it. He messed it up. Right? So history plays a part when we talk about Islamization. All right, just to finish off this lecture, I'm going to discuss very quickly some of the contemporary developments that we can, of course, take this up and during the question and answers. Some of the contemporary developments that worries us here in Singapore. Firstly, when we talk about Islamization of institutions, there is a movement in Malaysia wanting to have Islamic laws. Islamic laws is not a typical law that we have a common law and everything, but they want to go back to the Quran laws, And these are some of the punishments of the Quran laws. Right? Even though in history laws evolved, depending on society, this group are championing wanting to go back to hudud laws. Death penalty, lashes, chopping of hands and all that. Right? So this kind of thought can be found in Malaysia. Not so much in Indonesia. I never came across this in Indonesia. But Malaysia, we hear about this. And this was at one time championed by PAS, the Islamic Party of Malaysia. Before the last elections, there was talk that UMNO will join PAS. Of course, they did not join in the last elections, but there was talk of them cooperating on forming greater laws, Sharia laws in the country. Here we see Najib Razak sitting side by side with the past president. This was not seen in the past, but it shows that there is a greater move to embrace conservative Islam in the country. That's Malaysia. Indonesia too is a cause of concern. Right? We all were talking about the rise of conservative Muslims. One incident happened was 2016. I'm sure many of you know about this. The Jakarta governor Ahok was accused of blasphemy for insulting Islam. Of course, he was misquoted. But you see the rally that happened in Jakarta rallied people. He lost the elections in 2017 and he was later ousted. So a lot of analysts, observers are worried about what is happening in Indonesia. What happened to the smiling face? Of course, the man who I took photo earlier, Ma'ruf Amin, is now with Jokowi. I've written quite a bit about this man. If you want to read them, feel free to download them. I interviewed him. I studied him basically. But if you look back at some of his religious opinions in the past, he's not the most moderate Muslim that you can think of. Basically, if you look at some of his views towards religious minorities, towards the Shiites, towards the Ahmadiyyas, you see problems there. But this man became Jokowi's running mate because Jokowi himself feared that without a Muslim leader like him, he will suffer like Ahok in 2016. Well, Jokowi won. Again, though not so convincingly, but he did. Of course, we're all concerned about terrorism. It's happening all around us. But this has to be seen as a spectrum. We're talking about conservatism, exclusivism. If you're not careful, it will lead to terrorism. It is a spectrum, right? And it does not happen in a vacuum, okay? So should we just be concerned about terrorism and forget about non-violent extremism? No. If you're not careful and you don't handle it properly, it will lead to that. It has the potential. Right? So we have to look at it as a spectrum. Impact on religious minorities, this happened in Malaysia, it happened in Indonesia, the Shiites, for instance. Shiites and Sunnis I would want to go through, but they're just different schools of thought. Majority are Sunnis, but the Shiites are minorities, and hence they are not allowed to basically conduct their religious practices in both countries because they're seen as not Islamic enough. Yeah. It's happening in both countries. This is something that is lesser known. We always talk about the more controversial issues, but the attitudes of Muslims also change. They now express their religiosity outwardly. Some people call this a car sticker Islam because it led to paste their affirmation of faith in their cars. As I mentioned earlier, halal certification became a major issue for many Malays today. And Malays get a bit upset, if Fish and Co and Delifrance were no longer halal-certified at one time because they had some problems, but people take up the social media feeling upset about this, right? It just shows that the middle-class Malays have a certain taste and they want to be good Muslims at the same time. This one, if you go to Kuala Lumpur, there is a famous place that sells expensive tudungs. Tudung is mainly to cover modesty, you know. It's just a simple plain cloth, but this has become an industry. Fashion has become about. This is also a change in terms of the attitude. The way Islam is interpreted is changing, right? People are talking about modesty, people are talking about fashion, they're willing to spend money, lots and lots of money on tudung, but they forget the important value of Islam, which is to be humble and to express humility. Right? Similar with halal certification. People are talking about methods of slaughtering, but they forgot about wastage, which is an important value in Islam. They forgot about cleanliness, right? Health, you know, they forgot all about this. So the concept of halal itself is very, very, in a way, focusing on rituals. Right? So these are some of the issues that happen. Sharia tourism. You can come across Sharia hotels. There's Sharia Airline, which closed down, I think, recently. I'm not sure what's the status of Sharia Airline, but Sharia hotels still survive. Right? This is my favorite, Sharia spa. I've never been to a spa, but I don't know what is a Sharia spa. No pornography, halal products, places for rituals, and that's how they define. So it becomes very cosmetic. Yeah? It becomes very surface, cosmetic. I got this document from Indonesia. They've passed me these pamphlets, but I'm just curious what is the halal. This is a growing market. So remember the 1970s, they want to Islamize everything. So we have Islamic banking, Islamic insurance, Islamic investments, Islamic car. I think I've heard about that in Malaysia. And now they have Islamic spa. Everything has to be Islamized. I don't know what next, yeah? But this is basically a trend. The kind of Islam is different. Right? There's some examples of a halal certified hotel. There is this halal certified indelible ink. You know what's indelible ink? When you go for elections, you have to dip your finger. That one also has to be halal certified. I just don't know what to say. Because it just shows a trend, right? It just shows a trend in society. All right, just to conclude, I think overall I must say that Islam practiced in Southeast Asia are non-violent. We heard about terrorist cases here and there, but I must say they are a minority. And terrorism is only one small part. But the other parts you need to be careful. I think Muslims here are generally moderate, but if you're not careful in managing them, the exclusivist type will be the angry type of Islam, which is my biggest worry. We need to distinguish violent extremism and non-violent extremism. We tend to focus on violent extremism, we forget the non-violent type. And what I've explained today are the non-violent type. Okay, towards religious minority. And it's not only Muslims versus non-Muslims. Within Muslims themselves, they are suffering even more because of this exclusivist mentality. There's a move to Islamize everything, as I've showed you. We cannot stop this trend, but I think we need to educate the masses about Islam is not only seen in terms of that aspect, but the values aspect. Equality, humility, modesty, rights of privacy. These are things that we rarely talk about when we talk about Muslims. And lastly, the anger and the threat of westernization itself has caused certain changes in the psyche of Muslims here that we need to fight back with a bigger Islamic agenda. And what happened in Indonesia and Malaysia under Mahathir and Suharto defines the kind of Muslims in their respective countries. Why is Malaysia ahead of Indonesia? It was because Malaysia started earlier under Mahathir and Suharto started later. So I think we need to go back to history, 600 years, 700 years of history, but the 1970s is also an important episode that shapes the psyche and identity of Muslims in this part of the world. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
For all that you know about history, is there the possible scenario that Malaysia and Indonesia, because of what has happened and the way that you've described it, the challenges would implode? In other words, the influences are not going to come from outside, but within the country and within all the different factions of Islam, that this would cause problems for them?
Well, I think we cannot discount the fact that, as you mentioned correctly, the internal factors that will shape the identity or the controversies that's happening in both countries. Sometimes we often talk about, for instance, when we talk about issues dealing with Southeast Asia, we tend to blame the external forces, mainly the Middle East, and hence the term Arabization. That's not true, actually, because we have to also look at the dynamics within each countries. Now, for your question, let's look at both countries. Indonesia. Internally, I think the country is very fragmented. And again, it's a very huge country, comparatively. There are various forces. They are the extremist type. They are the moderate voice. And they're the middle ground. And a very good example of what you said would be what happens on campus in Indonesia itself, right? We talk about external influences and the internal dynamics. We have different kinds of Muslim groups in Indonesia. One influenced by the Egyptian, one could be influenced by the Turkish, one could be influenced by, Yemen. And there are so many kinds of influences. So, and these are all competing groups in Indonesia. And hence there's no clear winner. They cancel out each other, right? So earlier we talked about the Ahok case, for instance. That's only one camp. But we often focus on that group. We did not focus on the groups that challenges the conservatives, which is quite strong in Indonesia. And this one has to go back to history as well, because during Suharto period, he invested quite heavily on the moderates. Okay, so that's Indonesia. Malaysia is slightly a different scenario. Now, I'm not painting a bad picture of Malaysia all the time, but the scenario is different. Comparatively with Indonesia, the moderate voices are very, very in low numbers. And in Malaysia itself, which I didn't get a chance to explain today, what happened in the 80s, right, when Mahathir became Prime Minister, he brought in people into the government. What he did, that Suharto did, was to give them power. And hence they manage institutions with power. Malaysia and Indonesia are different. In Malaysia, it's only one of the few countries in the world that a fatwa, you know what's a fatwa? A fatwa is a religious opinion. A religious opinion in Islam is just an opinion. I don't like the fatwa, I can don't listen, right? But in Malaysia, that's not the case. In Malaysia, a fatwa becomes law. A fatwa can become law of the country, right? So, and you cannot challenge it. So, who is more powerful? Indonesia, we do not have a similar situation. So, internally, these dynamics play a part. And Indonesia, there's a self-checking mechanism, but in Malaysia, it's very difficult. And if it's not managed carefully, it will lead to greater consequences and greater problems. I think now the current government in Malaysia is trying to reverse that. I think earlier there was talk that the very institution which Mahathir himself supported, called JAKIM, J-A-K-I-M, has gone too big. It's got a 1 billion budget. And there's a lot of complaints. I think they are now trying to reverse that trend, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because history has taken a certain discourse, a certain direction that is difficult to reverse. So internal dynamics have to be understood to look at the problems.
On the topic of Maldives become more Arabicism, what are the views of Singapore Malays? Are they rejecting, or what are their views of Malay Muslims?
First and foremost, I don't think they see it as part of Arabization. And there's a lot of talk about Arabization from outside the Muslim community, not within the Muslim community. To them, they are just becoming more religious. Okay? But let me just go a little bit deeper into this topic of Arabization because it's created a lot of controversies. And I'm not excluded from this controversy because I wrote a piece and people totally misunderstood my arguments and they lashed on me on social media. I become the bad guy. But let me just share with you my real views. Singapore is an open society, right? They are all exposed to external influences, right? Some wants to dress like the Arabs, some want to dress like the Koreans, some want to dress like the Westerns. It's up to them. We are living in a democracy, right? But the main issue is this. The main issue is when it became exclusive. I'll be very concerned if people say, if you do not dress like an Arab, you are less Muslim. For me, I don't care if you want to dress like Arabs, you want to dress like anybody, I don't care. It's none of my business to basically dictate. Right? If you want to go to the mosque dressing like Arabs, it's fine. But the moment you say that is the only true Islam, that's problematic. Because if you look at history itself, as I mentioned in my slides, when Islam came to this region, it did not eradicate, did not erode the culture. That means you can come with your baju Melayu. You know what's a baju Melayu, right? You know how Hari Raya season, you see the Malays are so proud of the baju Melayu. How they can lead prayers in baju Melayu, not a problem, right? They greeted one another in the Malay way. That's not a problem because if you study Islam itself, it's open to culture practices, right? But 70s, 80s is the change because politically they feel we need to Islamize, and what they mean by Islamize is to borrow from the Middle East. Why? The history I showed you earlier, the competition between the two Iranians and the Saudis, right? Exporting their popular culture, exporting soft power, it had an implications on the Muslim mind. And hence, you see in Kelantan at one time, they banned most of the Malay arts. The Malay Mak Yong and all these things are dying because it was banned and said that this is not Islamic. It became black or white. It's either right Islam or wrong Islam, whereas actually Islam did not say anything about it, right? So this topic of Arabization itself, for me, if you want to behave like somebody that's not from your own community is fine, but do not be exclusive. Do not be authoritarian.
How do you assess the threats of ISIS to Southeast Asia?
Again, I'm not a terrorist expert. I don't do terrorism as a field of study. I study the culture society. But my sense is that globally, ISIS threat is in a decline, globally, right? I think, again, as an outsider, from far away observation is that they have lost significant ground. But for this region itself, in terms of, we still hear cases and reports about the ideas, which is, of course, a main concern. Groups being sympathetic towards the ideology, right? My sense is that it's not only ISIS, ISIS may be formed and it may die a natural death. But what next? Initially we have Al-Qaeda, remember? Right? It's the ideology. It's the ideology. Groups that we do not tackle, again coming back to this resurgence period where they feel that we need to have an alternative. They cannot live with a secular world or a world that is modern. They feel that this is not part of them, it's not part of their identity, and hence you can name it ISIS or whatever, but there will still be a belief that we need to form a system which is alternative, right? And it means, I came across some of my interviews, some of the EDs I interviewed, saying that the constitution is a colonial constitution. I still hear this kind of views, It's a Western colonial constitution. And hence, what is the constitution? We need to return to the Quran. We still hear this kind of views. The Quran is basically a book, a text that guides Muslims. It's not a constitution, right? But some people believe so. So how do you change that? I think we need to educate these groups by saying that things evolve. The constitution itself is important in managing a multicultural society like the way we live in now. How can we still talk in a language that is of the 10th century? If this group are still talking in the sense there is an Islamic state and a non-Islamic state. This is a 10th century kind of discourse. This is a 10th century kind of debate, There is a Darul Islam and Darul Harb. Can we talk about Darul Islam and Darul Harb today? Where there is a lot of interchangeable migration. We cannot even talk about a single homogeneous country in this world. It's very difficult. Can we still have an Islamic constitution versus a non-Islamic? It's difficult to talk like this in this modern day and age. So just to answer your, I don't really know, but there's a lot of sympathizers. There are some being sympathetic, but I think politically they are in a decline. Similarly, the case in closer to this region, the Marawi and in the Philippines, I think they are in a decline. In terms of support, I think they are quite weakened.
You've also talked about the strand of non-violent extremism. How do you think that will actually shape the Southeast Asian landscape? I mean, this force. Yeah.
Well, you need to look at it. Some of the examples we need to elaborate. What exactly do we mean by non-violent extremism? Violent extremism is very clear-cut. The use of force, the use of violence, terrorism. But non-violent extremism, we rarely quantify it. I think we need to really go down and define exactly what is meant by non-violent extremism. One of it is hate speeches, to actually promote hatred towards the other of a different viewpoint. I think this is something that we need to look at. Because you see, if we do not stop it there, right? It started as a simple, I disagree with you, and then it will move on and said, you don't have a right to practice, and then next step, the more violent one, you have the right to be wiped out. It's a spectrum. Now, if you do not tackle it head on from the very, very beginning, and we allow that to happen in society, then it will not be good for the society. So it has happened in Indonesia, right? In the past, they were quite tolerant, but certain groups are exploiting these issues to the extent that we have incidences like the Ahok case. Right? We have many other instances in Indonesian society. In Malaysia too, a lot of these things happen. For instance, the rights of minority groups such as Shiites. This Shia thing, right? They have coexisted with the Sunnis in this part of the world for centuries. Yeah. But because of political reasons, it was only in the 1980s that they declared the Shias as deviant. It's as recent as 1980s. And then once the fatwa is declared in Malaysia, it becomes law, and hence you don't have the right to preach. for the longest time, they have coexisted. So, non-violent extremism, if you do not tackle it head on, it could weaken society and it could transform into bigger problems.
The Vice President of Indonesia, whom you interviewed and the President knows very well, what do you think is his political agenda? You mentioned Ahok a few times, and I believe that he played an important role in ousting Ahok, whom we know was jailed for insulting Islam based on fabricated evidence. Now, the fact that Jokowi had to invite him to be his vice presidential candidate showed the kind of influences he's able to command. Now, by inviting him, do you think Jokowi is actually riding a tiger? And do you think he's able to dismount from this tiger?
I think, I'm talking about Ma'ruf Amin, for those of you who don't know. It has got to do with the building up of what happened in 2016. As you mentioned correctly, he also played a huge part. But for the longest time, Ma'ruf Amin has always been a politician. He was, if I get it correctly, at the age of 28, he was already a politician. He's now in his 70s, I think, right? So he's always been part of politics. But one time he fell out from politics. He was for the longest time been involved in this organization called MUI. MUI is the Ulama Council of Indonesia, which is an organization which I studied very closely in my thesis. So for the longest time, he's played a huge role in the organization, and that's where he was lobbying the president at the time to, to give this organization the rights to issue halal certificates, to play a role in Islamic economy and finance, to expand its role. So he's been very political at that point in time. That's where his influence grew. But when he was the leader of that organization, that was when the organization issued many religious rulings which are quite problematic. And until today, people view him as a conservative leader because of his role in that organization. For instance, when he was a leader, he issued this fatwa called Sipilis. Sipilis is not what we know, okay? Sipilis is anti-secularism, pluralism, and liberalism. Indonesians are very good with acronyms. So Sipilis is anti. So he was the one who was part of that group, right? And today, he is seen as what? A moderate voice, very Indonesian vice president, Go back to history. Right? Go back to history. I still remember when I was doing my field research, so I attended a lot of these functions. He was there giving a speech about Sharia Tourism. So I got interested in Sharia Tourism because of him. Right? So that's Ma'ruf Amin. Now, why Jokowi chose him? Jokowi has other names, I think. There was a lot of speculation that he wanted Mahfud MD, his former constitutional judge, who's a very moderate figure, religious figure as well, but seen as being too progressive. I don't know what happened, but in the end, it shocked many people that he went for Ma'ruf. But Ma'ruf before this was also the advisor to Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Many people did not know this. He was actually an advisor to the president. So he has always been around in the political scene. The biggest question is what will happen to Indonesia with Ma'ruf Amin. Honestly, I don't really have an answer for that, but you must also look at the role of the vice presidency. Generally, the role of vice presidency is quite weak. He's there as a symbolic figure, maybe as a diplomat, but in terms of executive powers, I think it's quite controlled. That's my assessment. And number two, you know that the political situation in Indonesia is that if you issue a conservative voice, you will get backlash. Because as I said, This is a mechanism, self-checking mechanism in Indonesia. You know that when he came to Singapore during the campaigning, he sounded so moderate and so progressive. Why? He can change, because he knows the crowd, he knows the political implications if he decided to go on along. So you can see the shift, and there are other factors that will control him other than his own religious leanings. So I should say, don't worry too much about the situation. Yeah.
How would the emergence of Islamic extremism affect the creation of national unity and national identity in a multicultural society like Indonesia and Malaysia? And how would this affect the racial and religious minorities? Would they take on a more separationist stance?
How would it affect national unity? It's already happening. Let's talk about Malaysia first. My biggest fear for Malaysia is that the country, the way the politics is going on right now, you know that UMNO and PAS are going to unite. Pakatan Harapan is on the other side. And the kind of politics they're playing, my biggest fear is that it will be polarized into a religious camp. Islam versus non-Muslims. That's my biggest fear that's going to happen in Malaysia. Because the talk now is about Malay rights, Malay Muslim rights. Like, you are threatening Islamic rights, you are threatening Muslim rights. I think that's not good for unity in Malaysia. Because for the longest time, even though Muslims are majority in Malaysia, right, the founding fathers of Malaysia itself were very clear that Malaysia has to be multiracial. In fact, earlier I mentioned about Islam is the religion of the Federation of Malaysia, right? It's not exactly an Islamic state. It's not exactly an Islamic state. In fact, the earlier leaders of Malaysia said that Malaysia is a secular state. What it means that Islam is the religion of the Federation is that symbolically, that, if you have in parliament, you can recite the prayers in Islam. But it doesn't mean that it's an Islamic state. You have the Sultan as the head of religion. Maybe that's what it means symbolically. But other religions have the right to practice. But lately it has been interpreted that, do not harm Muslims or the Malays, It has gone a different direction than the drafters of the constitution itself. So it's not good for national unity. Indonesia is the same thing, but as I mentioned, Indonesia, it developed later. But the way politics is going right now in the last elections, as you can see, identity politics or religious politics plays a part as well. Both camps are using religion. Jokowi used religion. Prabowo also used religious sentiments. That has actually, as a map I showed you earlier, has polarized Indonesian society. But Indonesia, as I mentioned, is quite complex. It's a very big country, so it's always bound to be divided because it's really a huge country. But when we talk about national unity, we must also remember that it's not only about Muslims and non-Muslims, it's also about intra-Muslims. Okay? Divisions are also happening within Muslims and also within the Malay society as well. So if we're not careful, it will break even further the two countries. Oh, second part. Will it develop a separatist stance? Unlikely in Malaysia because they are majority. But if you talk about Indonesia, the biggest worry is that we have different provinces. But again, it's unlikely to happen because they are all majority Muslim states. Unlike in Myanmar and the Philippines, it's a different, and even Thailand for that matter, because there is a concentration of Muslims in a particular locality, which could be used to galvanize support. But Indonesia, well, we can talk about Aceh at one point of time, trying to separate, but then at the end of the day, it didn't happen. Yeah. But because it's a majority Muslim state.
What you said earlier about tackling the ideology so that no further groups of extremists may hijack the doctrines and come out further. It reminds me of the plan or the movement or the direction of one of the leaders of NU. I think it's Imam Yahya. So he has this Nusantara Islam. And then he was actually quite frank that there are certain important texts and traditions that are actually fueling all this ideology. So I'm not too sure, but he was saying that we need to take into account the pluralistic society and move away, like what you say, right? Move away from this tension between, it doesn't make sense anymore to talk about this tension between Muslim and non-Muslim states. So I think what you are saying is quite close to what he's saying, but he, I think about 2 or 3 years ago in an interview, he said he's actually feeling as not much progress to convince other people. So I'm not too sure whether, in your view, how successful, what's the chance of success of his approach, and if not, what other approach that might be successful?
Nusantara Islam is a very big word now in Indonesia, as I mentioned earlier. I think the leaders want to basically generate this whole thinking about archipelagic Islam. What they mean by archipelagic Islam is that to return back to the way Islam is practiced in this region. But the problem is that this issue of archipelagic Islam is being very highly politicized. Different groups have different interpretations about what exactly is Islam Nusantara. I think in essence of it, I would say that it's a very good move, right? To actually go back to what Islam means in this part of the world, which is to respect the culture, practices, and to respect the values of it, you know? The rights and the freedom to choose, the freedom to practice their religion, freedom of expression, and basically not to be authoritarian in the way we practice Islam. I think that is what Islam Nusantara should be. But the problem is that the issue has been highly politicized. Certain groups saying that, you know, they are all supporters of Islam Nusantara, but what exactly it means became unclear after that. In terms of progress, I would say yes. Again, things that happened in the 1970s, as I mentioned earlier, the move towards the resurgence of Islam, meaning, you know, to create an alternative versions of Islam that's against what is practiced in the past, more pluralist. It will take time to reverse that. It will take time to reverse that. Because certain, for instance, halal certification. Can you reverse halal certification? It's become impossible, you know. The way people dress, it's very difficult to reverse trends that's already, because you see, the resurgence, when they talk about things, it's black or white. How can you come in and say it's gray? It's tough. Because to them, it's already been cast in stone that this is yes or no answer. So Islam Nusantara is falling into this problem now. Right? Islam Nusantara is basically saying that it's not simply as black or white, it depends on who you're talking to, right? It's a gray area. You talk to a person who's very legalistic in the thinking, it's not easy. That's why I think there is not much headway, there's not much progress, because what happened has already been cast in stone.
What other approaches that we can try?
The approach itself, the idea itself is good. I think I will support the idea of the Islam Nusantara, trying to understand the culture, the diversity and the respect for local practices, and say that this is part of Islam. I have no dispute about that. But I think the bigger question is, how do we convince people to embrace that? This one requires politics. It requires a strategy, you know. Now, in Indonesia, maybe you can still have some hope because, as I mentioned earlier, the so-called the progressive voices are still huge in numbers. And they are there competing with the conservatives. And because why? Historically, Suharto allowed that to happen. You say about that in Malaysia? In Malaysia, there was this group called the G25. the so-called the moderate voices, trying to challenge the conservative voices. It failed because you can't challenge somebody who's been formalized and given power. How do you challenge that? So I think to move forward, we have the Islam Nusantara, we have this respect for culture, but the strategy that we need to adopt has to also be considered in order to make it a success.